On the morning of Thursday, March 14, 2024, at 7:42 a.m., the Cedar Falls Police Department received a 911 call from Margaret Hensley, a neighbor on Maplewood Drive. "I think something's wrong at the McKinney's house," she told the dispatcher, her voice tight but uncertain. Officers arrived at 512 Maplewood Drive within 7 minutes. The first floor of the two-story home presented an unsettling tableau. In the living room, 38-year-old James McKinney was slumped against the sofa, a single gunshot wound to the chest. Nearby, his wife, 36-year-old Laura McKinney, lay near the kitchen doorway with a small circular contusion on her temple consistent with blunt force trauma. Both victims appear to have died within the previous 6 to 8 hours. The home showed no visible signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared to have been taken. A coffee cup remained on the counter, a newspaper lay folded on the dining table, and the morning news played quietly on the television. Detective Robert Lang, a 17-year veteran of the Cedar Falls Police Department, later described the scene as eerily calm, almost as if the house itself was holding its breath. Nothing screamed chaos, but the presence of death was undeniable. Initial investigators noted that the positioning of the bodies and absence of signs of struggle suggested the victims may have known their assailant. Evidence technicians began methodically photographing and cataloging the scene. A Glock 19 handgun was recovered from the living room rug, and preliminary ballistics indicated it matched the bullet recovered from James McKinney's chest. No fingerprints on the weapon, aside from the victim's own, were detected. Blood spatter analysis suggested Laura's injuries were inflicted near the doorway, likely after James had already been shot. Neighbors, still in their homes, described hearing nothing unusual overnight. Some mentioned seeing a black sedan parked briefly outside the house in the early hours, though no license plate was noted. The quiet suburban street was suddenly the center of a high-profile investigation as local news crews began arriving within the hour. By noon, the story had already spread across regional news outlets, leaving the small community of Cedar Falls in shock. James and Laura McKinney were a couple well known in Cedar Falls for their involvement in the local community. James, 38, worked as an accountant at a regional firm, Cedar Falls Financial Group, where colleagues described him as meticulous, reliable, and quiet, though friendly. He had been with the firm for 12 years and had recently been promoted to senior accountant. Outside of work, he volunteered as a youth soccer coach at Lincoln Middle School, and parents often spoke of his patience and encouragement with the children. Laura McKinney, 36, was a nurse at Cedar Falls Community Hospital, specializing in pediatric care. Her co-workers described her as empathetic and thorough, someone who often stayed late to ensure her patients received attention. Neighbors recalled seeing her walking her golden retriever, Daisy, in the mornings, and she frequently hosted book clubs and neighborhood gatherings at their home. The couple had 2 children, Olivia, age 8, and Benjamin, age 5. Friends and family described the McKinneys as devoted parents who maintained a structured, stable home life. According to interviews with friends, the couple rarely argued in public, and when conflicts arose, they were handled privately. Family dynamics, however, were not without complexity. Laura's sister, Allison Harper, indicated in later statements that James had been under increasing stress at work for months, dealing with mounting responsibilities and a recent internal audit. Laura, according to Harper, had expressed concern about James carrying too much on his own and often encouraged him to seek support or delegate tasks. Financially, the McKinneys were stable but conservative. Their home, a modest 2-story built in the late 1980s, reflected careful planning rather than extravagance. James and Laura had no history of criminal involvement, and police found no prior reports of domestic disturbances or external threats to their safety. The day before the discovery of the bodies, James had left work early to attend a parent-teacher meeting, and Laura had been on a night shift at the hospital. Their schedules, verified through employment records and time-stamped surveillance footage at local establishments, confirmed that neither had any known conflicts or incidents that might explain an immediate risk to their safety. Friends and colleagues, when questioned, expressed disbelief. "They were careful, responsible people," one coworker said. "There was no reason to think anyone would want to hurt them. Not here, not in Cedar Falls." The deaths of James and Laura McKinney would soon reveal that even in the most seemingly ordinary lives, unseen pressures and hidden relationships could intersect with devastating consequences. Within 48 hours of the McKinneys' deaths, attention began to turn toward a person connected to both victims, Daniel Reed, 41, a longtime family friend and former neighbor. Reed had lived in Cedar Falls for most of his adult life, working as a contractor specializing in residential renovations. Known locally for his skill with woodworking and home improvement projects, he was considered reliable and personable, often taking on small jobs for neighbors and friends. Daniel Reed's connection to the McKinneys dated back over a decade. According to interviews, he had worked on several remodeling projects in the McKinneys' home, including a kitchen renovation in 2015 and the addition of a small office space in 2018. The families socialized occasionally. Shared barbecues, school events, and community fundraisers were common, though neighbors noted that Reed tended to be more private, sometimes awkward in social settings. Police records later revealed a history of escalating tension between Reed and the McKinneys, though none of it had previously risen to criminal concern. According to Laura's sister, Allison Harper, Reed had expressed frustration over a business arrangement with James. Around 6 months before the incident, Reed had completed a contract for a minor home renovation at the McKinneys' property. Payment had been delayed, and though the debt was eventually settled, Harper stated that Reed never really got over the way it was handled, making frequent complaints to friends about feeling disrespected and undervalued. Investigators also noted that Reed had financial difficulties of his own. Bank records obtained during the investigation indicated a pattern of unpaid debts, including a small business loan and multiple overdue credit accounts. Friends described him as meticulous with his work, but secretive about money matters. Psychologically, Reed presented a complex profile. Interviews with coworkers suggested a man who could be charming in brief encounters, but prone to irritability when challenged or contradicted. Detective Robert Lang later remarked in an internal report, Reed had the appearance of stability, but there were undercurrents of resentment, particularly toward those he felt had slighted him. By the time authorities obtained warrants to search Reed's residence, neighbors had begun noting unusual behavior. A few reported seeing him leave early in the mornings and return late at night, often with a boxy black SUV parked nearby. While none of these actions alone were criminal, they formed a pattern that, when combined with financial strain and documented disputes with the McKinneys, placed Reed squarely under suspicion. Within days, Reed was identified as the primary suspect in the deaths of James and Laura McKinney. While he initially denied any involvement during early interviews, inconsistencies in his statements and circumstantial evidence began to form the outline of what would become a deeply scrutinized investigation. The news of James and Laura McKinney's deaths sent shockwaves through Cedar Falls, a city of just over 40,000 residents where violent crime was historically rare. Within hours of the discovery, local news outlets began covering the story, framing it as an unthinkable tragedy in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Social media platforms quickly filled with speculation, condolence messages, and fear as residents grappled with the idea that such a violent event could occur in their community. Neighbors on Maplewood Drive reported feeling an immediate sense of vulnerability. Karen Willis, who lived 2 houses down from the McKinneys, recalled, "We all knew each other. Everyone leaves their doors unlocked sometimes. After this, it just doesn't feel safe anymore." Several families temporarily altered their routines, keeping children indoors and requesting local police patrols increase in the area. The Cedar Falls Police Department responded by setting up a public information line and holding a press conference on March 15, 2024. Police Chief Helen Carter addressed the community. "We understand the fear and concern this incident has caused. Our officers are working diligently to gather evidence and identify the individual responsible. We ask for the public's cooperation and patience as we proceed with our investigation." Local media coverage was extensive. The Cedar Falls Gazette dedicated multiple front-page articles and online updates to the story, emphasizing the victim's community involvement and the shocking nature of the crime. Regional television stations ran interviews with neighbors, friends, and colleagues, highlighting the stark contrast between the McKinneys' ordinary lives and their sudden, violent deaths. At the same time, conspiracy theories and speculation began to circulate. Social media posts suggested everything from robbery gone wrong to personal vendettas. Law enforcement repeatedly urged residents not to spread unverified information, warning that rumors could impede the investigation. Despite these warnings, fear and mistrust became prevalent in Cedar Falls. Even within law enforcement, the case drew significant attention. Detective Robert Lang noted that the combination of apparent premeditation and the lack of forced entry suggested a perpetrator who knew the victims personally. Internal memos describe the investigation as high-profile, delicate, and time-sensitive, with pressure mounting to produce results quickly. In the weeks following the murders, community vigils were held for the McKinneys. Over 200 residents gathered at Cedar Falls Community Park, laying flowers, lighting candles, and sharing stories of James and Laura's kindness. These events reflected both grief and a desire for communal healing, even as anxiety lingered over the unresolved nature of the crime. The investigation into the deaths of James and Laura McKinney began in earnest immediately after the crime scene was secured. Detective Robert Lang led a team of 5 officers, supported by forensic specialists from the Iowa State Crime Lab. Their primary objective was to reconstruct the timeline of events, identify potential suspects, and collect physical evidence that could corroborate witness statements. The initial phase focused on the home itself. Crime scene technicians conducted a meticulous sweep, photographing every angle and documenting the placement of objects. The gun recovered from the living room was sent for ballistic analysis. Early results confirmed that the bullet matched the weapon, and fingerprints were limited to the victim's own, raising questions about who had handled it immediately prior to the shooting. Blood spatter patterns suggested that Laura McKinney had been struck after James was shot, supporting the theory that both victims had encountered the assailant in quick succession. Investigators then turned to surveillance footage from nearby establishments. A convenience store camera recorded a black SUV parked near Maplewood Drive at approximately 2:18 a.m. on March 14. Although the license plate was partially obscured, the vehicle's make and model matched a black SUV registered to Daniel Reed. Additional footage from a gas station on the edge of Cedar Falls showed Reed's SUV entering town around 1:45 a.m., consistent with the suspected timeline of the murders. Detectives conducted interviews with friends, family, and coworkers. Multiple individuals corroborated that Reed had unresolved tensions with James McKinney over a delayed payment for home renovation work. Financial records further revealed that Reed had recently withdrawn a substantial sum of cash from his bank account, $4,200, less than a week before the murders. While investigators could not initially connect the withdrawal directly to the crime, it became a key point in understanding potential motives. Forensic analysis of Reed's residence uncovered additional evidence. Swabs collected from a pair of gloves in his garage tested positive for traces of blood consistent with Laura McKinney's DNA. A firearm found in Reed's storage shed matched the ballistics profile of the bullet recovered from James. Furthermore, text messages retrieved from Reed's phone suggested increasing frustration toward the McKinneys in the days leading up to the incident. In one message, Reed wrote, "They think they can ignore me and get away with it. I won't let that happen." Investigators also examined Reed's work history and personal interactions. Colleagues described him as competent but increasingly irritable and withdrawn. Some noted he had recently argued with multiple clients over payments and deadlines. This behavioral pattern, combined with the financial strain and documented disputes with the McKinneys, helped detectives construct a psychological profile suggesting a potential for premeditation. By late March, detectives had reconstructed a probable timeline. Reed entered Cedar Falls between 1:45 and 2 o'clock a.m., parked near Maplewood Drive, and gained access to the McKinneys' home. The sequence of events inside the home, James being shot, Laura struck, and the subsequent staging of objects, suggested a deliberate attempt to control the scene and minimize the appearance of forced entry. Each piece of evidence reinforced Reed's connection to the crime, providing law enforcement with sufficient grounds to obtain an arrest warrant. On March 20, 2024, Daniel Reed was taken into custody at his residence without incident. During initial questioning, he denied any involvement. However, as investigators presented the compiled forensic evidence, surveillance footage, and financial records, his statements began to unravel. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the McKinney's deaths were not the result of a random act of violence, but rather a calculated act rooted in resentment, financial strain, and perceived betrayal. Daniel Reed's motive emerged as a complex mix of professional frustration, personal grievance, and psychological instability. Interviews with Reed's friends and coworkers painted a consistent picture. A man who prided himself on his skill and reputation, yet harbored deep resentment toward those he felt had undermined him. The dispute with James McKinney over delayed payment for home renovations, while minor in the larger context of both families' lives, had triggered a prolonged fixation in Reed. In conversations with acquaintances, he repeatedly framed the incident as a personal slight, expressing that he had been treated like a nobody despite his years of effort and expertise. Financial stress compounded this resentment. Records revealed that Reed had fallen behind on multiple bills and loans, which he often attributed to clients not respecting his work. Investigators noted that the large cash withdrawal days before the crime was likely intended to facilitate immediate access to funds, suggesting premeditation. Reed's meticulous planning extended to his movements on the night of the murders, as corroborated by surveillance footage showing precise timing and careful avoidance of neighbors. Psychologically, experts later described Reed as exhibiting traits consistent with obsessive rumination and escalating anger. Forensic psychologist Dr. Elaine McCarthy, who evaluated Reed after his arrest, testified during pre-trial proceedings. Reed's pattern of fixation on perceived injustices, combined with limited impulse control and a need to assert dominance, created a dangerous environment. In his mind, the McKinneys represented both personal insult and financial threat. The crime was an attempt to regain a sense of control. Reed's relationship with the McKinneys was also marked by a subtle boundary blurring. While outwardly friendly, he often overstepped social norms, showing up unannounced, offering unsolicited advice, and making repeated comments about the McKinneys' perceived indebtedness to him. Neighbors recalled instances of mild tension, such as Reed criticizing James over project timelines or expressing dissatisfaction with the couple's handling of neighborhood affairs. While none of these incidents were criminal on their own, in retrospect, they contributed to a psychological landscape in which Reed increasingly felt justified in taking extreme action. By combining financial records, forensic evidence, and psychological analysis, investigators concluded that the killings were both intentional and targeted. James McKinney was killed first, likely to neutralize a perceived obstacle, and Laura McKinney's death, while potentially unplanned, reflected a determination to eliminate witnesses and secure control over the situation. The evidence painted a portrait of a crime driven not by passion in the conventional sense, but by a calculated convergence of perceived slights, financial pressure, and obsessive resentment. A chilling reminder that premeditation can take root in seemingly ordinary grievances. The trial of Daniel Reed began on September 9, 2024, in the Black Hawk County Courthouse. From the outset, it drew significant public and media attention. Courtroom seats were limited, with journalists from local and regional outlets present, reflecting the community's ongoing fascination and horror regarding the McKinneys' deaths. Reed, dressed in a standard dark suit, appeared calm but reserved as the proceedings opened. He pleaded not guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Karen Thompson, presented a case built on forensic evidence, surveillance footage, financial records, and witness testimony. The first week of testimony focused on the timeline of events. Detective Robert Lang provided detailed accounts of the crime scene, explaining the positioning of the bodies, the gunshot and blunt force injuries, and the absence of forced entry. Photographs and 3D crime scene reconstructions were presented to the jury, illustrating the sequence of the murders. Lang emphasized that the evidence suggested premeditation and a calculated approach. Forensic experts testified regarding the physical evidence linking Reed to the crime. Ballistics analyst Marcus Lyland confirmed that the firearm recovered from Reed's shed matched the bullet that killed James McKinney. DNA analyst Dr. Sofia Ramirez explained that traces of Laura McKinney's blood were found on gloves in Reed's garage, establishing a physical connection between Reed and the victims. Witnesses painted a broader picture of Reed's behavior and relationships with the McKinneys. Allison Harper, Laura's sister, recounted multiple instances in which Reed had expressed irritation and resentment toward the couple. Neighbors testified about seeing Reed's black SUV parked near the McKinneys' home late at night in the days leading up to the murders. James McKinney's co-workers discussed his professionalism and lack of known conflicts, highlighting the seeming randomness of Reed's vendetta. The defense attempted to frame Reed's actions as circumstantial. Reed's attorney argued that the evidence linking him to the crime scene could be coincidental or contaminated, and that his financial frustrations did not constitute motive for murder. Reed himself took the stand briefly, maintaining that he had been at home during the night of March 14 and that any surveillance appearances were misidentifications. Cross-examination by the prosecution, however, exposed inconsistencies in Reed's statements. Text messages obtained from his phone were presented, including messages expressing frustration with the McKinneys and language suggesting premeditation. "They'll see what happens if they ignore me," and "I won't be taken lightly." Combined with surveillance footage and physical evidence, these messages reinforce the prosecution's argument that Reed had meticulously planned the murders. Throughout the trial, the jury remained attentive to the details of the investigation. Forensic photographs, financial documents, and expert testimony were presented with the intent of leaving little room for doubt. Court observers noted that Reed's demeanor, quiet, controlled, but occasionally evasive, contrasted with the severity of the charges and the evidence presented. By the end of the fourth week, closing arguments framed the case in stark terms. ADA Thompson told the jury, "This was not a crime of passion. It was not an accident. It was a deliberate, calculated act rooted in obsession and resentment. The evidence points clearly to one individual, Daniel Reed." Reed's defense attorney urged the jury to consider the circumstantial nature of the evidence and the lack of eyewitness accounts. The stage was set for deliberation, with the fate of Daniel Reed resting in the hands of 12 jurors tasked with weighing both tangible evidence and psychological testimony. On October 18, 2024, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury in the case of State of Iowa v. Daniel Reed returned to the Black Hawk County Courthouse to deliver their verdict. The courtroom was packed with family members, media, and members of the community, all awaiting the culmination of a 6-month investigation and a month-long trial. Foreperson Margaret Collins stood and read the decision. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Daniel Reed, guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder." The announcement was met with a mixture of audible gasps, tears, and whispered conversations. Laura McKinney's sister, Allison Harper, later described the moment as a relief, but it didn't erase the loss. It just meant someone was finally held accountable. Reed remained expressionless as the verdict was read, though his eyes occasionally flickered toward his defense counsel. Following the verdict, sentencing proceedings commenced. Judge Thomas Everett presided over the hearing, reviewing the severity of the crime and the premeditated nature of Reed's actions. In his remarks, Judge Everett emphasized both the calculated planning and the profound impact on the victim's family and the community. "This was not a spontaneous act of violence," he stated. "It was deliberate, cold, and calculated, leaving a trail of grief and fear in its wake." The court heard victim impact statements from family members. Allison Harper addressed the court directly. "James and Laura were the heart of our family. Their children, Olivia and Benjamin, will grow up without their parents because of one man's obsession. No sentence can bring them back, but justice must be served." Laura and James's colleagues, friends, and neighbors also provided testimony about the couple's character, underscoring the profound disruption caused by their deaths. In the final sentencing, Judge Everett imposed 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, the maximum under Iowa law for first-degree murder, The decision reflected both the severity of the crime and the court's assessment of Reed as a continuing threat to society. Reed's attorney indicated plans to appeal, citing procedural arguments, but the ruling remained a definitive statement of legal accountability. Outside the courthouse, local residents expressed a mixture of relief and lingering sorrow. Candles and flowers left at the scene of the McKinney's home remained as silent tributes to the lives lost. Community leaders emphasized the need to support the family in the aftermath, including counseling services for the children and neighborhood watch initiatives to restore a sense of safety. The verdict closed a chapter in a case that had gripped Cedar Falls for months, offering justice for the McKinneys while leaving an enduring imprint on the community's collective memory. In the months following Daniel Reed's conviction, Cedar Falls slowly began to process the trauma left by the McKinneys' deaths. For Olivia and Benjamin McKinney, the transition was particularly difficult. The children were placed in the temporary care of Laura's sister, Allison Harper, who worked closely with social workers and child psychologists to provide stability and support. Counseling sessions focused on helping the children understand their loss and cope with the absence of both parents. The McKinneys' friends and colleagues also felt the lingering effects of the crime. James's co-workers at Cedar Falls Financial Group described an initial period of heightened anxiety and mourning, punctuated by memorial services and commemorations in the office. Laura's fellow nurses at Cedar Falls Community Hospital organized a scholarship fund in her name, ensuring her legacy of compassion and care for children would continue. For the broader Cedar Falls community, the murder was a stark reminder that violence could penetrate even the quietest neighborhoods. Community organizations responded by establishing neighborhood watch programs and offering workshops on home security and conflict resolution. Local schools implemented additional counseling resources for students, particularly those who had interacted with the McKinneys or knew the families personally. Daniel Reed, incarcerated at the Iowa State Penitentiary, underwent psychological evaluation and treatment while serving his sentences. Prison officials noted that Reed remained largely withdrawn, often refusing to discuss his motives or express remorse beyond brief rehearsed statements. Court-appointed psychologists later described him as exhibiting traits consistent with obsessive fixation and a persistent inability to manage interpersonal conflicts constructively. Media coverage continued in the months following the trial, though the tone shifted from sensational reporting to reflective pieces on the victims' lives and the lessons learned from the case. Publications highlighted the importance of recognizing escalating conflicts, the role of mental health and financial stress in criminal behavior, and the need for communities to maintain vigilance without succumbing to fear. The McKinneys' home on Maplewood Drive was eventually sold, purchased by a family from outside Cedar Falls. Neighbors noted that while the street eventually returned to a semblance of normalcy, the memory of the tragedy remained embedded in community consciousness, a reminder of both human vulnerability and the importance of collective resilience. The tragic deaths of James and Laura McKinney left an indelible mark on Cedar Falls, prompting both reflection and action within the community. While the criminal justice system ultimately held Daniel Reed accountable, the broader implications of the case extended beyond the courtroom. One of the clearest lessons concerned the danger of unresolved conflicts and escalating resentment. Reed's grievances, while initially minor, a delayed payment and perceived slights, festered over months, demonstrating how personal fixation, when combined with stress and psychological instability, can culminate in extreme violence. Experts emphasize the importance of recognizing early warning signs of obsessive behavior and intervening before disputes escalate. The case also highlighted the role of forensic science and meticulous investigation in achieving justice. Surveillance footage, DNA evidence, ballistics, and financial records collectively constructed an irrefutable narrative linking Reed to the murders. Detective Robert Lang reflected, "Without careful documentation and adherence to protocol, the truth might have remained obscured. The case underscores how thorough investigative work safeguards both justice and public trust." For the community, the McKinneys' deaths reinforced the fragility of perceived safety. Cedar Falls, like many suburban towns, had relied on the assumption that violence was unlikely within its borders. The tragedy spurred the establishment of neighborhood watch programs, enhanced communication among residents, and support networks for families dealing with grief and trauma. Finally, the case raised enduring questions about human nature, responsibility, and accountability. While Daniel Reed bore legal and moral responsibility for his actions, the story serves as a reminder that ordinary grievances left unchecked can escalate into catastrophic outcomes. It emphasizes the importance of empathy, conflict resolution, and mental health awareness as protective measures against preventable tragedies. In remembering James and Laura McKinney, the community honors not only their lives, but also the lessons their deaths imparted: that vigilance, compassion, and timely intervention can prevent ordinary grievances from turning deadly, and that justice, though delayed, remains a cornerstone of societal stability.